Hi everyone, welcome to this afternoon's session on the synoptic essay. I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes just to wait for more people to join us, and then we can get started. As soon as you join, please say hello in the chat so that I can know who's here. Right, just 30 more seconds and then we'll get started. Okay, right. We're just going to get started. So I'm just sharing my screen. Now, a couple of things. There'll be a slight delay between when I change slides. Don't worry, that's absolutely normal. So it just takes a couple of seconds for it to change slide, that's all. If there are any questions, please comment in the chat. If you're watching this later, still comment in the chat because we can see the comments later on, or send us an email at Primrose Kitten as well. Okay, so let's get started. So what I want to do today is I'll briefly go through the essay and how to structure it, but more importantly, I want to go through two examples of essays and how you should approach them and what your plans should look like. And then ideally from that, you would go and research more into the topics suggested so that you can then write up the essay. The most important thing is make sure you know that the essay is about 40 minutes of your paper 3. So it's important that you learn to manage your time properly. Before you even start writing the essay. Before the exam, practice writing a few essays so that you manage your time properly. Okay, so 25 marks is allocated to the essay. Like I said, 40 minutes, but if you finish the rest of your paper early, then you get more time for the essay, although I would make sure that you've checked the rest of the paper because you don't want to lose marks unnecessarily because you haven't checked through. Now, the most important thing about your essay is that it should show depth and breadth. So you need to make sure all the terminology that you're using is A-level terminology and not GCSE. If you do use GCSE terms, they carry no extra marks, even if it's beyond the AQA course. So just avoid GCSE terms and make sure you rehearse what the new terminology is for A-level. Now, one major change between old S's and new S's is that now all the S's seem to have the word importance or roles, so it's extra application. So if you just described processes, you wouldn't get many marks. What they do is AO1 is just the content, and that's just the knowledge, and that can only get a maximum of up to 15 marks. But it goes hand in hand with AO2, which is the application, and that carries 10 marks. So yes, you can get 11 to 15 if you just included AO1, but ideally there should be some links to application if you want to secure the top band. So if you want to secure 15, you should include some application. What all the examiner reports are saying, students are writing a lot of content and knowledge, but very little application. So if you want a high mark in the essay, make sure you include the application as well. Now, there's several bands. There's 5 bands that the essay is marked in. And what examiners have said is most students fall in the multistructural, and that makes sense because a lot of students are writing about knowledge. If you want to fall on the top end of that band, you need to link in some application. But students that are aiming for that top grade, so if you're aiming to get an A star, you should really be working in the relational or extended abstract. I think only about 0.5% managed to get in the extended abstract category. That's not to say it's impossible. It just requires that your core content is really, really secure. So here's an example of what the difference is between multistructural and relational. So for the multistructural category, what happens a lot is students have some errors. Now you can have errors, that's absolutely fine. A few errors is absolutely fine. However, if you include irrelevant topics, so topics that are not linked to the question, then you're being marked from this band or lower. If you're not making links, then you can't get higher than 15. If you're not writing enough detail for A-level, again, you're probably going to end up on the lower end of this band. You may have some clear explanations and terminology, but what we're aiming for here is having an overall. So making sure that your essay, for it to be relational, you have very few errors, even fewer than multistructural. You can have some irrelevant information, but again, very minimal, ideally none, if you've read the question and you've linked it to the question. And what a relational essay does is that it reads as a story. One paragraph links to the next one, which links to the next one, and it's interrelated points and very clear explanations, and the biology is at A-level content. Now, you can easily move a relational to an extended abstract by including content that's beyond your specification. However, if that content is GCSE, like I said earlier, then that content does not count at all. So what you would need is to really know what's beyond, and you get that from extra reading and check against your specification. The specification is a very, very useful thing to look through because it tells you what you should know, and then it gives you extension activities as well. So things that you should think about avoiding. You should really avoid GCSE contents. You should really, a lot of students, what the examiner reports are saying is that a lot of students are starting to talk about application, but then they're ending with vague statements relating to, oh, the organism would die, the organism, this wouldn't function properly. What do you mean by that? Would it be inhibited? Would it stop? Is there an enzyme that's not working properly? And what impact does that enzyme not working properly have? Please make sure you don't write vague statements. Most of the essays that I marked in the last few weeks had a lot of vague statements. And so feedback to my students was, please make sure you expand on the application. Just mentioning an application is not good enough. Okay, and then check the science. So if your core content is not secure, what would happen is you end up describing a process and it's actually wrong. So an example could be when you should be talking about a nitrogen containing compound, if you mention carbohydrates, they do not contain nitrogen. So ideally, you should be linking it to proteins mainly, nucleic acids. So make sure you know the content. I would say that's the starting point. Your content needs to be very, very secure. The next thing that you need to avoid is abbreviations, but only you can use some abbreviations, but they have to be ones mentioned in the spec. So DNA is fine, RNA is fine, but things like SA cannot be used. ATP is absolutely fine, but check the specification and practice writing full names. If you're going to say DNA, capital letters so that you make sure that it's accurate because it's linked to the science there. Then as a really like good practice to have, don't think you will learn your essays at the last minute. They require quite a lot of practice. So try to do a couple a month or one a week, depending on where you are in your spec. Ideally, any essays that you've written already, when you finish content, you need to know where you are in content. When you finish your content, rewrite those essays to include the new content that you've learned as well. And then some people may be thinking, oh, I want to get an A star, so therefore I want an extended abstract answer. Well, if you focus too much on beyond A level, before you're confident, you end up missing a lot of marks on the basics. So make sure you're confident first in core content and then look at how you can extend that as well. Don't rush too much to go beyond A level. Okay, now in terms of structure, you need to make sure that you write a plan. A plan helps you actually organize your thoughts and look at what links you can make, look at what key processes you're mentioning, when you can overlap an application. It just helps you think logically. And in an exam environment, you might end up being quite stressed, as rightly so. And what you want is you want not to forget what to talk about. So therefore, a plan really helps. Try to get 5 topics in. 4 is absolutely fine. The examiner reports say 4, at least 4 is fine, but 5 topics just helps you secure in case your application is not great on one topic. But you can't have 5 AS concepts. Then it's not synoptic. What you want to have is topics from across the spec, and this is where the interlinking happens. So our suggestion is that you have 10 paragraphs, 2 paragraphs per topic. Now I'll show you a grid that you can do to make sure that you cover everything that you should cover in your essay. You need a lot of interlinking. So I've said to students to avoid headings as well, because what headings do is that they cut the content and it stops instead of just linking it. So just write one continuous essay, just sort it out into paragraphs. So maximum 10 topics is what we would recommend. Now, on the screen at the moment, it will come up an essay, and this is an example where the question is the importance of gas exchange. And I will pause for a couple of minutes, just scan through the essay. Can you identify what the main errors are, just in terms of structure? How would you improve it? Is it clear enough? Is it linked enough? What would you do if you were writing the importance of gas exchange in organisms as an essay? So I'm just going to pause, just giving you some time. Zoom in. If it's too small, just zoom in and read even just one paragraph. And just as a bit of guidance, that this is an essay that was 4 pages long. And so this is only the first couple of paragraphs. So think about where this is going as well. Does it have enough flow? And is there things they've done that they could just get rid of? Are they answering the importance of gas exchange? So I'll just pause for a couple of minutes. Now, if you're watching the video later, read the excerpt, and then think about the questions as well, and then we can discuss them as well. Okay, so it would be useful if you read through and annotated it and identified any errors. But the key things is this person has an introduction. Now, you don't need an introduction in your essay. A lot of students in the past used to include introduction. It's absolutely not needed, so it wouldn't carry any extra marks. They've talked about how gas exchange is vital. And then they've already linked in a story which is beyond the course. But have they really focused on the question? So this whole section, it's beyond A level, but is it relevant and is it directly linked to the question? I would say it isn't. They could have talked about a lot more processes. They could have gone into the actual meat of the essay before giving any of these examples. The last half of this excerpt is actually where they start talking about gas exchange. Again, there's very little application, but they have talked about importance for diffusion. They've talked about importance for life, but again, very vague. So this would already be marked in the category of multistructural. And depending on what else they included later, it probably would be on the lower end, because they haven't included much else. The first couple of sections are talking about beyond the spec, but it's not directly linked to processes as well. And remember, gas exchange is a process. So ideally, we want them to start talking about the importance of gas exchange immediately, right into the essay, instead of waffling on about the story, which the reader, the marker, may not even know. So it wouldn't mean much as well. Okay, so how would we improve that essay? So what I want to do is I've changed the layout. So this is an idea of how you can plan an essay, and it's a different question, but what could you do? So this is we're doing predictions. Primrose, Kitten have done predictions this year of what essays could come up based on the pattern that we've looked at from past papers, and this is one of the predictions. So the question is, discuss the importance of organisms being able to respond to their internal and external environment. And this is where we just focus on the science. What would you include? Now, you want to know what the knowledge is and then what the application is. So what I would do is draw this table as your plan, and then specifically state every single stage that you include as knowledge, every single process that you include as knowledge. And then when you link in the application, you're then covering the importance of that process in response to internal and external environment. Now, this is really an essay about homeostasis, because homeostasis is just where you control your internal and external environment. And so to be able to answer this essay, your knowledge of what goes in and out of cells and what organisms and cells are exposed to will be very, very important. So things you could think about. I've broken it down into 4 main areas. So, we said 4 or 5 topics is fine. So focusing on cells, you could look at what key molecules are being transported in and out of cells, and why those molecules are being transported to answer the question. The organism, the cell, is responding to changes both inside and outside, and that's why it's moving those molecules. So you could talk about what's diffusing in, osmosis, active transport, with examples, exocytosis and endocytosis. And you could link that to a lot of other things. You could then move on and talk about binding affinity, hemoglobin, negative feedback. If you're going to talk about bacteria and infection, you could talk about chemiosmosis. In plants, you could talk about gas exchange and why it's important to respond to too much water going into the guard cells, for instance, and what processes that affects in a plant as well. Okay, now when you talk about processes, so the knowledge part, okay, why is that important? So for oxygen, for cells to have enough to be able to carry out respiration, they need to have oxygen. If they don't have oxygen, it will be anaerobic respiration, and then that has its negative effects. You can always then link into specifically why oxygen is much better. So why would cells want to make sure that they take in enough oxygen? And that links to the electron transport chain, because oxygen is an acceptor at the end of the ETC. You can then also look at why it's important to respond to changes in ion levels. So if the cell has got different concentrations of sodium ions and potassium ions, that will lead to pumps opening and an influx or an efflux of sodium and potassium ions, and that will lead to a very specific response and a very specific process. So you could link then into muscle contraction, you could link into synaptic transmission, and what you could then also do is link into heart rate, control of heart rate. You could link into how pathogens are really good at infecting hosts. You could link into how we respond to infections and how plants respond to infections. You could look at how glucose regulates, how our bodies or how organisms regulate glucose movement, and why that's important to regulate. Why is it important to respond to glucose, an environment of high glucose? What would happen if you didn't respond? And then you can also mention some chemical mediators as well. Now, at this stage, there might be some science words that I've used that you may not know yet because you haven't finished the topics. All you would need to do is when you finish the topics, you go back to this essay and you include a lot of detail from those last two topics. So hormonal control, nervous control, that's got a lot of linked detail to what you did in year one as well. The next thing that you could also talk about is you could link into action potentials and actually focus on synaptic transmission. Why is it important to respond to an action potential arriving? There's a lot of diseases and a lot of conditions where neurons have worn away. So like the myelin sheath has worn away and the person's not able, the motor neuron is not able to pass that message on. So the synaptic transmission is not able to occur. What would happen in that case? So motor neuron disease is an example you could give there. If you didn't respond to action potentials arriving, would you be able to then have reflexes? If you didn't respond to external stimuli, would you be able to protect organs that are very vital, like the eye? So remember that reflexes are there as a protective thing for organisms, whether it's a plant or an animal. Reflexes are really, really important for organisms to respond to. And then you can look at taxis and kinesis, and you can give examples. Now, please avoid giving examples that are all related to humans and all related to animals. You need to balance your argument there. So here I've given examples for plants. You could talk about IAA distribution and tropisms, and you could look at what the plant is responding to and why that's important. Why is it important that plants respond to changes in light intensity? What would happen if they didn't? Now that directly links to the light-dependent reaction, which would then again link into the light-independent reaction. And then animals, it could be a defense mechanism. You do a required practical on taxis and kinesis, and you would do one using maggots or mealworms, and you look at the movements they make in response to a stimuli. Why is it important? Why do certain animals go in the shade and others don't? How do animals respond if water levels are really low? What changes in their behavior would affect their survival? So think about adaptations and what selective advantages those provide, and then always link into the lack of response. So I would pause here and look at all the topics that I've mentioned, and then think, do I know enough about all these topics that I mentioned? Is there any that I need to read up on? And if there are some that I need to read up on, what is the A-level content? What is the GCSE content that I can't mention? You would notice, ideally, good students would link all these topics through. So diffusion could come up later. Exocytosis can come up in synaptic transmission. You could talk about the role of ATP in muscle contraction. You've just included a lot of topics and a lot of links, and the story reads very, very well. But this is just an idea of how you could organize your knowledge and your application that you would mention as well. So I'll just pause for a second, and I would pause the video if I were you and look at these topics and then judge whether you need to maybe revise a bit more on some of them before you then write this essay, or you actually need a little bit more background knowledge, and then look beyond the spec. What comes as beyond the spec? So for instance, for IAA distribution, you could talk about the experiments which are in the spec, but they're not in great detail, but you could look at any other experiments that have been done in terms of response and plant responses as well. So just pause for a second for you to process the slide. Okay. The second question that I wanted to go through is the importance of energy transfers within and between organisms. Now, this question, there hasn't really been a question like this over the last few years, so since 2014. So this is highly likely one of the questions that could come up. And it's important to really understand what energy transfer is and where it happens. Now, read that question. There's two parts. So within an organism, so where does energy transfer happen within the organism? And then between organisms, where's the energy transfer happening between organisms? So some examples of topics that you could include are details of photosynthesis, details of translocation. You could also include transpiration, which involves evaporation and conduction of thermal energy. You could then include details on food chains and food webs, and you could mention heterotrophs and autotrophs. You could include how energy is actually transferred, so the energy currencies of the cell. So ATP is one of them. You could include NADP, reduced NADP, FADPH, FADH. You could include details of digestion. Just make sure that whatever you're including, you're answering within and between organisms. So the first, food chains and food webs, is between organisms. Digestion can lead to between organisms as well. So you could talk about feeding and why we process food before we use it. What's the energy that's locked in, and what energy do we then get from that? And what I would say is your knowledge of energy stores and energy transfers here is really, really important. So some things that you could include when you're talking about photosynthesis. Obviously, you've got to start at the beginning. You've got light energy that is then being absorbed in the thylakoid, and you then describe the light-dependent reaction. And we know that from that, you then get ATP once you've got moving down the electron transfer chain. And that then ATP plus any product of photolysis of water will lead into the light independent reaction. So that energy transfer has happened between those two stages as well. You could then link in the actual energy transfer. So we're going from light energy in the atmosphere to a chemical store. And then there's this series of chemical stores. So it's glucose, it's pyruvate, and where is it ending up? It's ending up in respiration. Why is it that important? Then you link in as to what that generation of that extra ATP is important for in terms of metabolic pathways. Be specific, mention processes for respiration and photosynthesis, mention glycolysis, mention electron transport chain, go into a lot of detail. The other thing that you could talk about linked to plants is translocation and the movement of sugars from source to sink, and why is it important that the glucose moves to a sink, and what would happen if glucose did not move into the sink from the source. Now remember, the source is anywhere where glucose is being generated or sugars are being generated, so it links in beautifully to the light dependent and light independent stages. And then also pass that on, link it then nicely leads into food chains, because most organisms will then feed on plants. Plants are kind of our starting point, and without them, we wouldn't have the high survival that we have among species as well. So when you link into food chains, then talk about how that energy is then transferred between and within cycles between organisms, and link into productivity, so net productivity and gross productivity. Also mention where that energy could be transferred back into the environment, either as a waste or as a useful thing. Remember that you've got saprobionts, you've got different organisms that actually rely on decaying material for survival as well. So that's quite useful to include as well, because then it shows that you're not just talking about animals, and you're not just talking about our direct benefit, you're also talking about microorganisms and larger organisms and other organisms that are dependent on cycles as well. Now, the application there, linking to the building of biomolecules. So again, when you're mentioning metabolic processes, you're actually describing the metabolic processes. So link into protein synthesis, link into carbohydrate breakdown in digestion, and then carbohydrate molecule synthesis. So what happens to the glucose, what happens to the glycogen stores, and that includes quite a lot of A-level content that isn't AS as well. So that gives you a really nice synoptic link, and use the high terminology there. Then obviously, like I mentioned, using ATP as our currency is really, really important, and mentioning how that energy transfer occurs by talking about cyclic and non-cyclic phosphorylation, but also substrate level phosphorylation detail, which links into respiration as well, and why that's important, and all the different reactions that rely on ATP and the energy locked in ATP for them to occur. So you could talk about action potential, and where active transport is being used in the presynaptic bulb to then allow an influx of calcium. You could talk about core transport. You could talk about ion transport in the root hair cells. There's so much that you could mention, and notice these are linking. So we started with macromolecules almost, and we're going into like smaller molecules, but we're still linking in. You could link ATP and the use of it in terms of making biomolecules like nucleic acids as well. And then you could also think about where other molecules that involve energy stores come from, so other chemical stores, e.g. the chemical stores from digestion. You could then link in how enzymes help this energy transfer as well, and again core transport comes up again, and then where that glucose ends up. Now, yes, we've split it into 4 topics that you could talk about. All these things in effect link. So you don't have to repeat information. You just have to make sure that you've given enough application examples for every single topic that you talk about. And you've made sure that the science is correct, and you've checked that you haven't been vague about the applications, and you've made sure that you've expanded on the processes where energy is then being transferred within the organism and between organisms as well. Now, like I said, please practice this. So this would be a much more challenging essay to write compared to, let's say, an essay about diffusion. However, my advice would be, just because you look at an essay question and think it's easier doesn't mean that you should go for it. Maybe roughly write down a key points for each essay, because you've got a choice of 2, and then decide which one you have more application and more links to, instead of just going for one. If you read examiner reports, you will find that sometimes when students have chosen what is seeming to be the easier topic, they've actually scored very lowly because they've just focused on basic knowledge, and they found it really difficult to include high terminology, and therefore they've then restricted themselves into a multi-structural essay, not a relational or an extended abstract. So challenge yourself. It requires a lot of practice. But with these 2 essays as maybe your starting point for this year, after you've done this, you will find that you have a lot more knowledge for all the other essays as well that you can use. So just pause and have a look at this. What extra detail would you write? I would watch over this video a few times to make sure that you've got all the other examples that I've given off. There's not really enough space for me to go into extra detail as well. But if you look in the essay booklet, there's loads of examples of essays that you could practice that could come up as well. And they do come up. If you practice a lot of essays, chances are one of them that you've practiced will come up as well. Okay, so then we just move on. Okay, so you've done the science, you've made sure that your core knowledge is secure, you understand how to do application. What do you then do next? When you start practicing this, it's going to take you a lot longer than 40 minutes. Still time yourself, and what you should see over time is that you are getting closer and closer to that 40 minutes. The more content you become confident with, the more likely it is that you will stick within that time frame. Now, if you do English as an A-level, you are more likely to write in a very logical way, and you're more likely to add a lot of extra words into your writing. And what you want is you want to move that and shift that to become more succinct. And you can do that by actually reading around your subjects a lot more. So there's a lot of social media channels that you can subscribe to. And when any new development comes up, it just pops up. You don't have to reference any of them. You're just giving key examples that are beyond the spec. So for instance, if I was writing an essay about genetics or mutations, I would then link into key diseases that have been in the news. COVID is one of them, and that is, the rise of mutations has led to it spreading like wildfire. But also in your textbook, there's sections which have beyond the spec, and they are worth reading. I would say even more important than journals, because they have exactly the right content and the right level that is understandable to you as well. Please check that your science is correct. Please check all the processes you're mentioning, that you actually understand the process, so you don't end up writing about a process and mentioning the opposite of that process, because you would lose marks if you have significant science knowledge that is not correct as well. So once you've watched this session, what you would then do is you would go and find some essay titles to practice with. Start with the essay titles that I've talked about, the 2 essay titles that I've talked about in the video, because those are our predictions for this year. See what else you could add to them, and then make a timetable of when you're going to focus on essays and how long you're going to spend on them. Time yourself. Ideally, your time should be reducing as you progress, because you end up being more and more confident. Don't worry too much if you struggle at the beginning. They are quite difficult, so I'd say read a few examples in the essay booklet that Primrose, Kitten have made. It also includes some examiner feedback as well. So teachers who are examiners have commented on sample essays as well. So it is really, really helpful, because if you look at exam papers, although they give you good titles, what they don't do is they don't give you exemplar essays. So what this booklet has done is gone into a lot of detail, and there's a lot of essays for you to practice with as well. Now, if you do have any questions, just email them to us, and we can respond to those as well when you watch over this. But also we'll be doing some sessions at Easter, and ideally you should be able to send questions through, but just get in contact if there's anything else that you would like us to cover. And hopefully this has given you a bit more of an idea about how to structure and the science to include in your essays for paper 3. Okay, so we are going to end there. Please let us know if there's anything else that you would like us to focus on, and whether this was useful, and any feedback is useful feedback, so that we can improve our sessions as well. So thank you so much for listening, and have a lovely rest of the half.